Hey y'all, this is Mr. Roseman, and it looks like I'm back in my classroom. Well, not really. This is from a picture I took last year of my board so that I had something to go by for this year, and it actually turned out to be quite helpful considering we're now online. Um, but I want to give you a really quick rundown of some major things to think about in terms of decolonization, which occurred after World War II, from the late 1940s through the 1970s, although there were some cases where some Western states held on to colonies into the 1980s, even early 1990s. But the bulk of former colonies gained their independence in that 30 to 40 year time frame. Um, when you were looking at different colonies and how they got independence, consider the reasons why it happened as a general historical process after World War II. That's something we need to consider. Why did it happen after World War II? So consider what's happening to those Western powers after going through two world wars, the moral grounds on which they had been making arguments about empire building and maintaining empires, and what had been happening to colonial people during the length of the 1900s, especially after both world wars. Some things to consider when looking also, generally speaking, at a lot of these colonial movements for independence, which is that decolonization process where colonies go from answering to metropoles to being independent nation states. Usually there are a number of ways in which nations gain their independence, some of which overlap. For example, there are some nations that carried out armed struggle, sometimes from the outset, others after attempting to use civil disobedience, peaceful strategies for independence. Some examples of nations that attempted armed struggle for independence included Vietnam from the French, Kenya with the Mau Mau movement, guerrilla warfare in the tropical jungles of Kenya. Algeria, which is in North Africa, gaining independence from France via guerrilla warfare as well there. Even South Africa, the ANC eventually turns to using violence in order to convince the Afrikaner minority to end apartheid and grant universal suffrage to the not limited just to the white population there, but also to the black majority. Sometimes armed struggle or civil disobedience resulted in negotiated independence. So this is where a metropole and their imperial governments sat down with nationalist movements and nationalist leaders in those colonies and work through a system for decolonizing. So usually with negotiated independence, it's a gradual transfer of power, which means that usually there's assistance with establishing new systems of government that new nations are going to use, oftentimes imitating the systems of government that their metropoles had. For example, Kenya, after independence, following the Mau Mau movement and negotiations with the KAU, the Kenya Africa Union, Jomo Kenyatta and the KAU that he was leading negotiated with the British, and there's a gradual transfer of power after Kenya had established a parliamentary system in the same vein that Britain had a parliamentary system. So we also saw how India gained a negotiated independence following the strategies used by Jinnah and his Muslim League and the INC guided by Nehru and Gandhi and their civil disobedience campaigns. So those are things to consider. We also have the roles of transnational movements. So these are attempts at trying to unite people across national borders based upon common ethnicity or cultural values. Some examples of this would be the Zionist movement. So that drew upon Jews across multiple nations and on multiple continents, if you consider that a large population of Jews living in the United States. with this common view amongst other Jews of trying to establish their own nation state of Israel in the former Mandate of Palestine. Transnational movements like the Pan-Arab movement that especially grew in strength in opposition to the British, and then eventually the Zionist movement following the establishment of Israel in 1948 as the British withdrew from Palestine and handing over authority to the United Nations within the establishment of Israel in 1948. We also had the examples of the Pan-African movement that arose after World War I, and there's still feelings of Pan-Africanism, although we know that is an extremely difficult goal to achieve considering the many different cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, tribal backgrounds of Africans, and attempting to unite together for a common purpose. Nonetheless, transnational movements have a key role in many of these nationalist movements for decolonization. Some other things to consider, nationalist leaders in former colonies, they were usually of some sort of Western educated background, usually elites. And we've seen examples of that in India in particular, people like Gandhi and Nehru from upper caste, Jinnah, well-educated upper-class Muslim in India. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, he actually studied at the University of Pennsylvania, Western-educated. Ho Chi Minh as well lived in the United States for quite a while before returning to Vietnam and establishing a communist nationalist movement there in North Vietnam, pushing for independence using guerrilla warfare against the French. Regardless of how these nations gained their independence, there were matters of new nations forming with the question of where are we going to draw our boundaries. There were many that kept their old colonial borders. For example, in Africa, most of the brand new African nations that formed following decolonization, they kept those same borders that were established back in 1884 to 1885 with what major event? You said the Berlin Conference, you're exactly right, where we saw the partitioning of Africa between many different European states and that scramble for Africa. And that created brand new problems, such as the mixing of different ethnic groups that caused problems in the long run once those African nations got their independence. Some nations, new nations, their old borders were redrawn. For example, India. What's our evidence there that India at the time of independence in 1947 had its former colonial borders as the British Raj redrawn? If you said the partitioning of India into India for the Hindu majority, but also with the guarantees supposedly that the religious minorities would be protected, plus the partitioning of India for the creation of a new nation called Pakistan for the Muslim Indian majority. That's an example of old colonial borders being redrawn. And with that came new conflicts, especially there with India between Muslim nationalism in Pakistan versus Hindu nationalism in Pakistan that has resulted in ongoing conflict up to the present. Other examples of former colonial borders being redrawn, a good example of that was with the British Mandate of Palestine. Whenever Britain withdrew their control over Palestine, realizing they were in over their heads in terms of the ethnic turmoil and demands by different groups like the Zionists and the Arab Palestinians, they withdrew and handed over authority to the United Nations that was created right there after World War II. The United Nations decided to try to solve the problem of Palestine by partitioning Israel into separate nations of Israel and Palestine to try to satisfy both groups. And they also did the same thing with Jerusalem, partitioning it to satisfy different groups who held religious, political claims to that city. And that has created long-term turmoil between Zionist Israelis and many Arab Palestinians who see each other as having themselves having rights to that land. So with that, as you're going through your chart today and looking at India and Pakistan, the creation of Israel and Palestine, the creation of Ghana, Kenya, independent South Africa, others, think about those big ideas of armed struggle versus negotiated independence, civil disobedience. Where are examples of transnational movements and how colonial borders are either maintained or redrawn in that process of decolonization.